She was 16, thin, quiet, invisible. Just a girl holding a tiny piece of chalk. And yet the world had no idea that this seemingly insignificant moment, this fragile shape against the fog-soaked harbor wall, was about to ignite one of the most terrifying shifts in German naval fear calculations. Because what she scribbled on the stone at dawn made veteran U-boat captains panic so violently that encrypted messages rushed back to Berlin, demanding answers the Admiralty did not have. And while commanders argued, while analysts scrambled, while officers insisted no civilian child could possibly crack patterns that even codebreakers struggled to understand, she kept drawing because she felt something in the tides, something in the rhythm of the waves, something whispering through the sea foam that only she could hear. And it wasn't magic, and it wasn't luck. It was a dangerous, brilliant intuition the world had rejected for years, the kind that got children mocked, dismissed, or punished. But she didn't care anymore, because she had seen enough convoys burn, enough terrified families weep for sons lost at sea, enough fishermen vanish without trace until the ocean swallowed them like they had never existed. And perhaps that was why she rose before the sun, shivering in the cold, letting the wind slap her face as she knelt before the seawall. Because the chalk felt safer than people, the patterns calmer than voices, and the ocean, despite its cruelty, felt more honest than any official she had ever met. Yet the unbelievable part wasn't that she drew where U-boats would surface or where they would attack next. The unbelievable part was that no one believed her until the day a submarine exploded, exactly where she had drawn an arrow. And even then, the officers had blamed coincidence, blaming luck, blaming weather, blaming anything except her quiet mind that saw the ocean's secrets like ink bleeding through paper. And though people whispered behind her back, though they stared and speculated and feared she might actually know more than they did, the Germans were the first to truly panic, because when their intelligence officer captured a photograph of her, chalk lines, those messy, curved streaks the town mocked as childish nonsense, Berlin's command room froze, comparing her marks to their top-secret movement charts and realizing with horror that the lines matched. Not by accident, but by terrifying precision, causing senior officers to lose sleep and analysts to demand reports explaining how a teenage girl in a fishing town had access to movements only 20 commanders on Earth were allowed to know. And while debates erupted inside hidden bunkers, while strategists argued about ghosts and informants and leaks, she stood alone at the seawall, listening to the water as if it were speaking its own secret language, the same language no adult could hear, but she had heard since she was a child. A language she never explained to anyone because she knew they would call her crazy. And though she didn't understand why she could do it, she understood one thing: the ocean was warning her, and she had no choice but to warn everyone else. But warnings only matter when someone listens, and almost no one did. Which is why they called her the Harbor Ghost, a name born from fear, misunderstanding, and awe. Whispered by sailors who claimed her chalk predictions made them feel seen by something too intelligent to be human, and while they mocked her in daylight, at night they prayed her chalk would appear again, because if she drew, they lived, and if she didn't, they might never return. But what none of them knew, what she herself barely understood, was that the chalk was only the beginning, the first sign of a terrifying truth buried beneath the waves, a truth the Germans sensed before her own people did. Because U-boat commanders, hardened men trained to fear nothing, started writing frantic lines in their logs about a phantom girl who saw them before sonar did, describing her as an omen, a shadow, a curse on the Atlantic routes. And Berlin responded not with strategy, but with fear, demanding countermeasures, demanding investigations, demanding someone erase the girl before she erased more U-boats. And still she kept waking before dawn, kept kneeling at the seawall, kept letting the chalk dance across the stone until her fingers turned white, knowing something terrible was approaching the harbor, something she didn't have words for, something she felt in the tightening pulse of the tide, something that made her hand shake as she drew a shape that wasn't like the others, an arrow, sharp, precise, pointing straight into the open sea. And for the first time in her life, she felt terrified because the ocean didn't whisper this time. It screamed. She stood at the harbor, the wind brushing past her like an old friend, and though the chalk was gone, She felt the weight of every line she had ever drawn, not as marks on stone, but as memories etched permanently into the tides themselves. And as she looked out at the shifting water, something deep inside her stirred, the same strange instinct that had first awakened on the morning. She realized the ocean was not chaos at all, but a slow-moving code that only needed the right eyes to unlock it. And now, years after those nights of fear and storms and spies, she felt that same code whispering again, tugging her back into a story she thought had ended. Because while the world celebrated victories, medals, generals, and machines, it had forgotten the one thing that changed the course of an entire coastline: a girl with a piece of chalk who listened harder than anyone had ever listened before. And as she closed her eyes, she remembered the moment she first sensed that the water's rhythm was not random. The way the harbor seemed to inhale before a U-boat surfaced. The subtle lift of the tide a few minutes before a periscope broke the surface. And as these memories flooded her, she wondered if the world had ever truly understood how close it came to catastrophe. How one wrong tide, one wrong prediction, one chalk line out of place could have cost hundreds of sailors their lives. And yet she, a girl no one trusted, had stood between them and destruction. And she thought about the spy, the storm, the broken chalk dust mixing with rain as she redrew the grid. And she realized that what terrified the Germans wasn't that the Allies had built some impossible machine, but that someone, a mere teenager, had seen through them, had mapped their movements with nothing but instinct sharpened by obsession. And as she took a slow breath, the harbor shifted again, the horizon bending just slightly, and she felt something odd, a quiet ripple in the water pattern she hadn't noticed in years, as if the sea itself remembered her, calling her attention to a new disturbance. Something off rhythm, something that didn't belong. And though she tried to tell herself it was nothing, that wars end and patterns change, her heartbeat quickened, because she knew that rhythm too well to ignore. And a terrible thought entered her mind. What if the oceans were whispering the beginning of another threat, not from the past, but from the future? Something she hadn't prepared for, something no one else could see. Because for all the praise she eventually received, the secret commendation, the quiet handshake from the admiral who told her, "You saved more lives than you know," she had never been able to silence that inner question. Did she decode the ocean? Or had the ocean chosen her? And if so, why her? Why now? Why a girl who never wanted glory, only quiet, calm mornings by the water, yet had been thrust into a war she never asked for? And as she walked along the seawall, her shoes scuffing the stone where her chalk once danced, she felt a familiar tremor beneath her feet, just a tiny shift, like the whisper of a submerged hull turning slowly far out at sea. A sound no one else noticed, but that hit her like a memory too sharp to ignore. And suddenly the entire war, all the fear, storms, and chalk grids, rushed back not as history, but as warning, and she felt cold. Because this wasn't the pattern of a submarine, nor the drift of a tide, nor the echo of a distant engine, but something stranger, deeper, a rhythm that didn't belong to machines or storms, but to something else entirely. Something ancient, something the sea had never shown her before. And as a gull screamed overhead and the wind twisted her hair, she wondered for the first time since the war whether the ocean had more secrets left. Secrets far bigger than U-boats, codes, or spies. And she realized with a quiet shiver that perhaps she had only scratched the surface of what the sea had been trying to tell her all along. And as she bent closer to the stone, where she had once traced intricate grids with a trembling hand, she felt the salt air prickling her skin, the way it always did before something extraordinary happened. And her mind wandered back to the nights of thunder and rain, when the harbor had been a battlefield, when every line of chalk she drew was not a drawing but a lifeline, not a pattern but a prayer. And she remembered the spy's eyes, the way he had followed her silently, the cold certainty in his stance, and the way the old fisherman had intervened at the exact right second. And she realized that luck had never played a role. It was her intuition, sharpened to a fine edge by fear and necessity, that had orchestrated every survival, every U-boat sinking, every life saved. And now, standing in the same place, years later, she could feel that same intuition humming, vibrating through her bones, whispering that there were more currents to read, more codes to decipher, more rhythms to follow. And as she traced her fingers along the wall where faint marks lingered even after decades, she felt the echo of those past lines merge with the present waves, the tides now carrying secrets she had never known. Secrets that made her pulse quicken and her breath catch, because she realized that the ocean was alive with intelligence, a consciousness that had once aligned with her, that had once let her glimpse patterns invisible to the human eye. And she wondered if that intelligence still remembered, still waited, still chose to reveal itself to a single human observer, a solitary girl who had listened too well and too long. And the thought both thrilled and terrified her. For she knew that the stakes were no longer merely the life of a sailor or the outcome of a battle, but something far greater, something the world might never comprehend. And as her gaze shifted to the horizon, the sunlight bouncing off the ripples and fractured glimmers, she noticed something unusual. A shift in the color of the waves, subtle but precise, like a message coded into the water itself, and her mind raced, calculating, connecting, hypothesizing, wondering if this was the beginning of another chain of events she had yet to decipher. A puzzle hidden in plain sight that might demand all of her knowledge, all of her patience, all of her courage. And she felt the weight of history pressing down upon her, pressing through the harbor, pressing into the wind that tousled her hair and stung her eyes, because every ship that had sailed under her predictions, every U-boat that had been sent to the depths under her guidance, every life spared and every life lost weighed on her conscience in a pattern too complex for most to see, but as vivid as the chalk lines that had once danced before her eyes. And yet, despite the magnitude of her past triumphs, she felt a shiver of unease, because even now, decades later, she could sense the currents shifting, subtle vibrations that hinted at movement unseen. As if the ocean had more secrets to reveal, secrets that might not be benign. Secrets that demanded her attention, secrets that, if ignored, could undo everything she had accomplished. And she realized that the harbor ghost was not just a name from the past, not just a whispered legend among sailors, but a living responsibility, an ongoing connection to forces far beyond ordinary comprehension. And in that moment, she understood that her journey had never truly ended, that the chalk, the tides, the waves, the storms, the spies, the battles, and the lives saved were threads in a tapestry still being woven, threads that required her presence, her perception, her courage, her intellect, her intuition, and her heart, all intertwined with the rhythm of the sea, all dependent on her ability to read, to anticipate, to act. And as she knelt once more at the edge of the harbor, letting the damp, salt breeze wrap around her, she felt the pulse of the water, the living heartbeat of the ocean itself, calling her to remember, calling her to act, calling her to ensure that every pattern she could perceive, every anomaly she could detect, every whisper in the waves would not go unheeded. Because the world depended not on generals, not on machines, not on luck, but on a single human being who could listen, who could see, who could understand what others could not. And that realization, immense and terrifying, filled her with both awe and fear as she gripped the invisible chalk in her hand, felt it between her fingers as though it were still there, felt the same determination that had carried her through storms, espionage, near death, moments, betrayal, and triumphs. And she knew that whatever lay ahead, whatever messages the sea now carried, whatever new mysteries presented themselves, she was the one chosen to interpret them. The one who had always been chosen, the harbor ghost. The girl with nothing but observation and courage, standing alone yet connected to a vast intelligence in the water. A silent partner, a force that had guided her hand, that had trusted her judgment, that had relied on her to draw lines across a canvas no one else could see. Lines that meant life or death. And as the sun climbed higher, painting gold across the harbor, she whispered softly to herself, a vow and a promise entwined. She would watch. She would listen. She would understand. And she would act no matter how invisible she seemed, no matter how small she appeared, because the sea did not lie, the ocean did not deceive. And she knew that, as long as she paid attention, as long as she remained patient, as long as she allowed herself to be the conduit for its messages, she could continue to protect, to predict, to prevent, to save. And even though decades had passed, even though time had changed the world around her, even though she was no longer the trembling 16-year-old holding a fragile piece of chalk, she carried the same clarity, the same vision, the same bond with the water, and the same responsibility to every unseen life that depended on her perception. And as she traced her hand along the stone wall where it all began, she could almost see the chalk lines shimmer faintly, almost feel the echoes of her past predictions hum through the stone, almost hear the ocean whisper the secrets it had always whispered, secrets that would only ever be understood by the one who had listened closely enough. And in that silence, in that connection, in that moment, she knew the harbor ghost had never truly vanished, and that the power of seeing patterns, of reading the waves, of understanding the unseen, still existed within her, alive, waiting, and ready to act again whenever the world needed her. And as she stood there, feeling the faint spray of seawater on her face, she realized that every lesson she had ever learned in those stolen pre-dawn hours, every tremor in the tide, every flicker of gull wings, every distant whistle of a ship engine had prepared her not just to predict, but to understand the subtle language of the ocean in a way no map, no machine, no fleet of officers could. And in that understanding, she found both comfort and dread, because the ocean was alive with a rhythm that had always guided her chalk, a rhythm she had trusted more than the opinions of men in uniform, more than the security of walls and guns and bunkers. And as the wind tugged at her coat, she thought about the countless nights she had spent crouched over stone, chalk in hand, storm howling around her, spies lurking in shadows, the water whispering secrets only she could hear. And how, despite the fear, despite the isolation, despite the disbelief of those who should have known better, she had acted, and acted perfectly. Because there had never been a choice between failure and success, the stakes had been lives. And she had understood that instinctively, deeply, viscerally, and as she traced the outlines of faint, worn marks on the wall where the grit of her teenage years once stretched, she could feel the echo of every decision, every stroke, every prediction, every tiny correction she had made under pressure, carrying forward into the present, weaving together in a complex tapestry of cause and effect that no historian, number general, no analyst could fully comprehend. And in that moment, she realized that her story was not just about the sinking of submarines, the safety of convoys, the saving of 776 lives, or even the whispered legend of the harbor ghost, but about the very essence of perception itself, the power of noticing what others ignore, of trusting one's intuition in the face of disbelief, of acting with courage when the consequences of inaction are unthinkable. And as she inhaled deeply, the smell of salt and stone and rain filling her lungs, she understood that her gift, the ability to read the hidden currents, to see the unseen patterns, to hear the language of the waves, was not a simple talent, but a responsibility that transcended time. That had begun the first day she had picked up a piece of chalk, and that now, decades later, demanded her attention once more. Because the ocean had not finished speaking, because the tides had more to teach, because unseen dangers could still arise, and because the harbor ghost, though grown, though older, though silent to the casual observer, was still very much alive. And the world, whether it knew it or not, still depended on her. She returned to the harbor one last time, the place where the first chalk lines had trembled under her fingers, where storms had threatened to erase her work, where spies had lurked in shadows, and where the ocean had whispered its secrets only to her. And as she stood on the edge of the pier, feeling the familiar pull of the tide, she realized that all the fear, the panic, the secrecy, the storms, the betrayal, the triumphs, the U-boats sunk. The lives saved, all of it had led to this singular truth. One determined, observant, and courageous girl had altered the course of countless lives without ever holding a weapon, commanding a fleet, or stepping onto a battlefield. Because her battlefield had been the mind of the ocean itself, her weapon, a tiny piece of chalk, her allies' intuition and courage, and in that realization, she understood the enormity of what she had accomplished, the quiet power of perseverance, and the uncelebrated heroism of listening when no one else would. And as she traced her hand along the cold stone wall, she whispered to the wind, "I did what I could, knowing that the harbor, the tides, and the memory of those 776 lives would forever carry her legacy. That the pattern of the water, the rhythm of the waves, the unseen codes she had followed, would continue to protect, to guide, and to speak to those willing to listen. And though the world had long moved on, the ghosts of her chalk lines remained etched in the hearts of those who had survived, a testament to ingenuity, courage, and the profound truth that even the smallest, quietest, and seemingly weakest among us can change history in ways the strongest and most powerful could never imagine." And as she turned away from the pier, the wind carrying a faint salt and chalk scent, she knew her story was complete. The harbor ghost had vanished from sight, but the marks she left on the world, the lives she saved, the patterns she revealed, the courage she embodied would echo across time forever, a silent, unshakable reminder that brilliance, bravery, and listening carefully can outmatch even the deadliest threats, and that sometimes the greatest hero is simply the one who refuses to be invisible.